Hello everyone, my name is Chee Han. I'm from the Singapore University of Social Sciences, and today I'm going to talk about a framework for designing virtual experiential learning courses or for converting existing experiential learning courses to employ virtual reality platforms. Just like most of us here, I started thinking about this because COVID-19 has forced many of us to have employ digital technologies to complement or to even replace our current face-to-face classroom interactions. As the head of program for overseas experiential learning at SUSS, I had to suspend all my overseas study missions. And unlike traditional classroom courses, I can hardly find a way to replace overseas study mission using online learning method, right? However, the arrival of virtual reality technologies begin to blur the line between what is considered the mutually exclusive relationship between online learning and experiential learning, because virtual reality promises a reality that one could experience remotely that approximates what one could experience in an unmediated manner. So if we were to begin with the premise that yes, virtual reality can indeed replace experiential learning, it begs the question, how do we go about designing virtual reality courses to replace experiential learning once? Right. In order to get to the discussion of this particular framework, I think I should provide a brief discussion of what experiential learning entails. Right, David Cope's experiential learning cycle theory, or the ELC theory, is probably the most popular and the most widely used amongst experiential learning practitioners. Right, David Cope defines experiential learning as learning through reflection on doing, and considers it the most natural way to learn, because apparently that's how we used to learn. All right, before the invention of writing, before the invention of the classroom, before the institutionalization of education. So what a learner does, right, in the good old days, is to go through these four stages called concrete experience, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, and active experimentation. Right, to have a better understanding of this, just imagine how a child learns not to mess with hot things. In other words, don't touch them because it hurts. Right, a child probably starts playing with fire, just like many of us have done so, and realizes that touching a naked flame hurts, right? And he goes on to observe that others have the same reaction as well. They touch the flame, they pull their hands away, and then they bawl their eyes out, right? And then he moves on to start reflecting on certain patterns that he observes, right? This pattern of experiencing pain by touching not only fire, but other similarly hot objects, and he comes up with a certain principle or a certain theme that governs all these observations that he had, right? And then he moves on to experiment with this particular principle or theme, and observes, experience all over again to verify or to falsify this particular pattern, right? The problem that I experienced with this ELC theory is that I came across certain institutional challenges with implementing it, right? For instance, the four-stage active experimentation requires a student to experiment with what they have arrived at stage 3. Right, so unless we have a series of courses that allow students to experiment with what they conceived in the preceding course, right, we can't really implement the fourth stage. Right, so I thought perhaps there's a way to simplify this to not only help the implementation of course, but to also help with the design of courses, right? So as a cultural anthropologist by training, of course, I begin to look back in the past Also given what David Cope said about experiential learning as the most natural way to learn, I went swimming in ethnographies of craftsmanship. And I noticed that regardless of which society this craft comes from, all of them share the following characteristics: object, skills, objective, and theme. These are the four components of every traditional craft we can find within the human species. Right. The object of a craft refers to the thing to be analyzed and transformed by the skills of the craft in order to fulfill a certain objective. Right. The theme is used to elevate and to port the skills beyond a narrow object. Right. To give an example, right, consider carpentry as a traditional craft, right? So clearly the object of carpentry is wood. Wood is the thing to be analyzed and transformed by the skills of carpentry, which includes chiseling, hammering, touching, smelling, for the objective of creating furniture, right? The theme could come in the form of poems, stories, so on and so forth. For instance, one thing that I came across in the study of traditional carpentry is the master would tell the student, right, that wood, right, all wood are alive, right? So regardless of what particular wood the student deals with, whether it's timber or teak, right, what the student is able to do is to port over the skills that he has learned from analyzing and transforming teak over to timber, because both of them are alive, right? So that's how humans have traditionally learned for at least the past 300,000 years, right? If you consider the history and the prehistory of Homo sapiens. Right. One of the common critiques of classroom learning amongst those anthropologists of education and experiential learning practitioners is what I call skills fetishism, right? So what has happened is that the classroom decontextualizes the skills and then conceives of them as learning outcomes that serves as indicators of skills that are purportedly applicable to real life, right? What this happens is that it distances learning from practice to the extent that students do not quite know what those skills are for, right? I'm sure many of us have come across students complaining that what they've learned in schools are not applicable in the real world. And I think it's not necessarily because they were taught badly, but rather they never knew what to apply the skills on, rather than not how to apply the skills. It is not a how problem, it is a on problem, the what problem, right? They don't know what to apply it on. So in my courses, I seek to resurrect what the human species has done for the past 300,000 years by bringing attention back to the object, right? To bring learning back to its very pragmatic nature, and then reverse skills and learning outcomes from the idea of how the object can possibly be transformed, right? So instead of asking the questions, how do we design a course that would provide students with certain skills, I think the question that we should ask is, what should students be experiencing in the course? Okay, so by integrating the anthropology of craft and experiential learning cycle theory, I came up with the object theme framework, or what I call the experiential learning framework at the Center for Experiential Learning at SUSS. Right. So by simplifying this, not only does it allow me to work with several instructors in running a course smoothly without facing institutional challenges, right? It also allows me to design assignments that remain true to the pragmatic roots of experiential learning, right? So if we only have the object indeed, it would help anchor learning in its pragmatic roots. But we also want the skills that student learn to be portable beyond the object itself. If not, if students go for overseas study mission to, say, Taiwan, well, whatever skills that he or she learns is only applicable in Taiwan. So what's the point of doing that? So we have to ensure that what students learn in Taiwan is also applicable in Singapore, and therefore we also introduce the theme. Right, to further clarify this, let me give you an example of a course indeed to Taiwan. The course is called Civic Altruism in Taiwan. I like to have the object in the title of the course. So on looking at the title of a course, the students immediately know that this is what they're supposed to experience. This is what they're supposed to learn about, right? So the object is civic altruism in Taiwan, right? But if we were to stick with only the object, then whatever skills that students learn to analyze and transform civic altruism can only be used in Taiwan. So we need a theme to port these skills over. So the theme that I've used in this course is called cultural relativism, right? So throughout the entire course, throughout all the assignments, students have one task, right? Is to not only observe, not only experience civic altruism, but also to reflect and conceptualize the relationship between civic altruism and cultural relativism, so that when they come back to Singapore and they start to look at our variant of civic altruism, right, they will be able to see that because of cultural differences, that our version of civic altruism, right, if it exists at all, right, is subjected to our cultural uniqueness, right? So by having this object and theme framework that governs experiential learning, not only do students learn skills that are applicable to the object, but also portable beyond one object. All right. So if we were to use this object and theme framework in the design of virtual reality courses, right, it raises a couple of issues, right? In number one, are virtual reality courses necessarily unmediated? As I said in passing earlier, right? So for some of us who have worn those virtual reality headsets, you will experience probably what could get as close as possible to reality itself. So at least from a subjective point of view, it is indeed unmediated, right? Of course, it depends on what we mean by medium, right? In traditional experiential learning courses, media refers to text, video, so on and so forth, right? But if the student does not is not able to tell the difference between reality and virtual reality, perhaps it is no longer unmediated, right? But most importantly, what virtual reality provides is an embodied experience, right? That videos, textbooks, so on and so forth are unable to provide, right? So they could come in the form of 360 videos, ARs, VRs, depending on your budget, of course, and depending again on the object of experience that you want to provide for your students, right? So finally, in summary, right, how do we go about designing virtual reality courses, right? Number one, you need to identify the object of experience. So instead of asking what do we want students to learn and then have to go through that vicious cycle of skills fetishism again, I think in the design of courses, regardless of whether it's virtual reality or experiential, we have to ask the question, what do we want students to experience, right? And then reverse engineer the skills and the learning outcomes from that particular object, right? And then pair it with a theme, right? That will allow us to decide how portable we want the skills to be, right? And after that, then we have to start thinking about whether the very object of experience, the thing we want students to experience, can it be captured in various VR media, right? So through this thought experimentation, right, if you use the example of entrepreneurial spirit versus conservation practices, you will find that objects which are much more tangible are probably easier to capture in virtual reality content, right? So in conclusion, right, what we can do with this framework it's not only for the design of experiential learning courses, but also any course that you would want to continue to anchor in its pragmatic employment, right? And interestingly, I also discovered accidentally that if we employ this object and theme, we are able to also at least address one of the central concerns in the use of simulation in training, which is this thing called fidelity, right? Even though some research has shown that high fidelity does not necessarily lead to better learning outcomes, right? With the use of object and theme, we can at least have I guess a rationalized way of deciding the level of fidelity, right, that we want to provide for students, right? So if we were to use the example of conservation practices in Sumatra, for instance, right, anything else that's nothing to do with conservation practices should not go into the itinerary, right? So virtual reality content is equivalent to the itinerary in traditional experiential learning courses. In other words, anything that is irrelevant to conservation practices should not go into the virtual reality curated content, right? So that would give us an answer to how do we even start creating that virtual reality content, right? So from that object, we include the theme, and then we reverse engineer the skills and eventually the learning outcomes, right? So I hope in this very short presentation, right, I'm able to share with everyone what this, the potential of this object and theme pair that not only applies to virtual reality courses, but to in traditional courses as well. So I hope during the conference itself, I'm able to answer any questions you have. All right, thank you very much, and I'll see you there.